Girl, the way you broke my heart, shattered like a rock through a window. I thought we had it so good, never really saw this coming. Oh, why you gotta be so cold? Why you gotta go and cut me like a knife and put our love on ice? Oh, girl, you know you left this hole right here in the middle of my soul. And oh, why you gotta be so cold? I'll read in a minute. What am I supposed to say if anybody asks me about you? I guess I'll tell them I live without you. How am I supposed to live when I built my life around you? Try to put yourself in my shoes. Oh, why you gotta be so cold? Why you gotta go and cut me like a knife and put our love on ice? Oh, girl, you know you left this hole right here in the middle of my soul. And no, why you gotta be so cold? I can only feel my love hanging on. I don't feel like it's over. I'm still on fire. Why you gotta be so instrumental? Oh, why you gotta be so cold? Why you gotta go and cut me like a knife and put our love on ice? Oh, girl, you know you left this hole right here in the middle of my soul. You know, why you gotta be so cold? 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 There you go. Figured it would be a good intro. Oh, Lord. I don't know. So 7 tonight, I ended up having a guest on my show, which kind of got messed up a little bit, but that's okay. I had Wes Holyfield live with me. Well, live on his TikTok. That man can sing. He's got a ton of followers. He actually, just tonight, just on his live, he had 750 viewers. So that was pretty badass, I thought. So yeah. Good luck to you, Monsieur, on your journey. So, let me see if I can get Facebook to come up because, every single day it's some kind of bullshit. Half the shit don't fucking work. I was getting pissed earlier too. Oh man, I was so mad. I was so mad. Couldn't get this shit to work right. It's all good. Pierre, my Texas honey. How are you? How are you? You can hear it probably. Super loud. All right. So, ladies and gents and everyone in between. Oh, finally. We finally get to finish the second book tonight. It's going to happen. Don't distract me. I mean, you're going to anyway. It's all good. If my motherfucking internet don't start acting right, I'm going to beat it. Why? Just why? Why? Never works, right? Never works, right? It's like 20 minutes late. Oh, all right. Getting frustrated now. Shit's pissing me off easy. Anyway. I need to sign these books and send them off to you if you guys are interested. Alright. So. Chapter 20 motherfucking 4 out of this damn forever book. I don't even know how long it's been since I started reading this shit. Alright. I swear to God, my internet better fucking start working. For real. Like, it's really pissing me off. It keeps cutting out. Keeps going, like, all crazy and shit. I'm gonna go ahead and say sorry because this is ridiculous. Chapter 24. Diagus finished etching the second to last of the formulas necessary to open the White Bridge. Though they'd spent weeks in the 16th century, they would return to a time in the 21st century, a mere 3 days after they had departed, which would etch the final complex series of symbols when they were ready to go. Outside the circle of towering megaliths, his Da and Nell stood with his wee brothers in their arms. He'd long since said his goodbyes. Now Chloe was hugging and kissing them. Both her and Nell's eyes were suspiciously bright. How easily, he marveled, women's faced with canyons of grief, men were wont to venture far and wide in hopes of circumventing. He wondered if women were, in some intangible way, stronger for it. While Sylvan and Nell gave Chloe messages for Justin and Gwen, Diagus pondered what he'd discovered last eve, after Chloe had fallen asleep. In the wee hours of the morn, he'd crept back down to the chamber library. He was no fool. He knew his canny father had broken off too abruptly when reading the final passages in the 5th book of Manannan. Yes, indeed, there it had been. One crucial bit of information Sylvan had opted to keep to himself. Diagus didn't need to ask him to understand why he omitted telling the words. Sylvan would argue that a prophecy was no more than a foretelling of a possible future. However, Diagus knew, and hadn't Tristan's experience with Seer Bisetta proved it, that the future foretold was the most likely future, which meant it was going to be damn difficult to avert. Inscribed in the 5th book of Manannan in a slanted and majuscule script, he had been his most likely future. The 13 shall be made one, and the world will descend into an epoch of darkness, more brutal than mankind has ever known. Unspeakable atrocities will be committed in the Dragar's name. Civilization will fall and ancient evils rise as the Dragar pursue their unceasing quest for vengeance. He could never permit such a future to become reality. Chloe's love had strengthened him, and hope burned like a beacon in his heart. Though the darkness was ever growing in him, his resolve and determination had never been stronger. He glanced at her, drinking her in. For their return, they donned the clothing they'd worn in the 21st century. She stood in her slim blue trousers and creamy sweater, her tousled curls spilling down her back. Desire quickened in his veins. Anon he would be loving her, and every minute betwixt now and then was a minute too long. He warned her how opening the bridge would affect him. I won't be quite myself, Chloe. You remember how I was when I came through the first time. I know, she said firmly. I know what you'll need. He gritted his teeth. I may be rough, love. I'm tougher than you think. A pause, and then those words he could never tire of hearing. I love you, Diagus. Nothing will change that. She was so wee, yet so strong and determined. She was, quite simply, everything that he'd ever wanted. Son, Sylvan's voice shattered through his thoughts. I'd have a word with you before you go. Diagus nodded and made his way towards Sylvan, who led him towards the castle. He'd already said his goodbyes to Da, Nell, and his brothers, and was impatient to go, lest someone weep again and tear at his heart. When you return, son, you must tell Drustin about the chamber library. Diagus blinked, perplexed. But he'll know. We opened it again, and you'll be passing the knowledge to Ian, and I'll be doing no such thing, Sylvan said calmly. But why? I spent some time last eve pondering the possibilities. If the chamber library is made known to the Kelter, it may affect too many things over the next centuries. It must be forgotten. 'Tis too risky for us to restore such a wealth of knowledge to successive generations, and think naught else might change. I plan to seal it this very eve, and will not enter again. Diagus nodded, instantly seeing the wisdom of it. Ever clever you are, Da. I hadn't thought of it. But you're right. It could indeed cause inestimable changes. 'Twas good he realized then that he and Chloe weren't remaining in the past any longer. He could trust his father to tidy up any loose ends if aught were to be found. Unable to ensure a prolonged leave-taking, he returned back to Chloe and the stones. Son, Sylvan said, in his voice low and urgent. Diagus kept his back to him. Hey? There was a long pause. If I could be there with you, I would. A father should be with his son at such times. Lad, give my love to Drustin and Gwen. But no, you carry the bulk of it with you. A kin Nadash shouldn't have favorites, but... Oh, Diagus, my son, you are always mine. When a few moments later Diagus returned to the center slab and began to etch the final symbols, he noticed Chloe staring at him strangely. Her eyes got misty again and her lower lip quivered a bit. He didn't understand until he pulled his head down to hers and kissed the tear from her cheek. Then, as the white bridge opened, she flung herself into his arms, clasped her hands behind his neck, and kissed him passionately. He pulled her legs around his waist and held her tightly. It became a battle of wills for him then. It was him against the devastating, shifting, dimensional storm. He felt as if he could only make it through the chaos of the white bridge without losing hold of her, he could make it through anything. He held on to her for all he was worth. Oomph! Chloe gasped as they hit the icy ground, still in each other's arms. A fierce little smile curved her lips. They'd made it without letting go of each other. She didn't know why it seemed so important to her, but it did, as it somehow proved that nothing could ever tear them apart. A low growl, a rough rumble, more animal than human, was the only sound Diagus made as he rolled her beneath him, slanted his mouth hard over hers. His body was rock hard against the softness of hers, his hips grinding into the cradle of her thighs. In a heartbeat, she was breathless with lust. The man had only to look at her to make her feel weak with desire. But when the hot, thick hardness of him rode between her legs, she became mindless with need. Every single time, her mouth went dry, and she felt shaky from head to toe, anticipating all those delicious things that he would do to her. All those ways of touching and tasting, all those very specific demands that he made of her, and she so loved filling. She yielded, greedily taking all of him, locking her arms around his strong neck, burying her fingers in his wet hair. They rolled and tumbled across the hail-covered ground as the rain poured down, and the wind shrieked deafeningly, numb to all around them but the searing intensity of their passion. Mouth sealed tightly to hers, his kiss was both dominating and yet utterly seductive, demanding yet coaxing. When he slipped his hands beneath her wet sweater, popped the clasp of her bra and cupped her breasts, she panted against his lips. There, she thought dimly. Oh, yes. He played with her nipples, rolling them between his fingers, tugging lightly, and she could feel her breasts swelling beneath his hands, growing excruciatingly sensitive. When he drew abruptly away, she cried out, reaching for him, trying to pull him back down on her, but he moved out of her grasp, leaning back on his heels at her feet. Her back arched as she stared up at him, his gaze black in the shimmering moonlight. Please, she gasped. He gave her a feral smile. Please what? She told him, in detail. His black eyes glittering. He laughed as she listed her many and varied requests, and she could see that her boldness was making him recklessly aroused. A month ago, Chloe would have never been able to say such things. But what the hell, she thought. He'd made her this way. His laughter was of short duration. As he listened, the desire narrowed his eyes and lust drew his chiseled features taut. He peeled away her jeans and sweater and stripped off her panties and bra, baring her to his hungry gaze. Then he picked her up and tossed her naked over his shoulder, his big palm possessively roaming over her bare behind. He stalked from the circle of stones, walking with her through the night, deep into the gardens. He stopped at a low stone bench where he deposited her on her feet, ripped open the fly of his jeans and shed them. In a matter of seconds, he was gloriously naked. Then the big, fierce Highlander with the black eyes, who clearly seething with impatience to be inside of her, surprised her by dropping to his knees before her. He planted lazy, open-mouthed kisses on the thin, sensitive skin of her hips and across her thighs. Gripping her bottom with both hands, he pulled her hips forward, his velvety tongue sliding, deep, slipping over her taut butt and deeper still. Her legs buckled, and she cried out his name. He didn't let her go down, but caught her weight and forced her to remain standing. his dark head between her thighs, his long hair like silk against her skin. Slowly he turned her in his arms, scattering scorching kisses over every inch of her behind, licking and teasing. His fingers slipping to the wetness between her thighs, desperate to have him inside of her. The minute his grip loosened a bit, she dropped forward to the ground on her knees and hands, and looked invitingly back over her shoulder at him, wetting her lips. He made a strangled sound, his breath hissing between his teeth. "Oh, lass," he chided, "I tried to be gentle." Then he was on her, covering her with his big, hard body, pushing into her. "Gentle later," she panted, hard and fast now. As ever, her sexy Highlander was only too willing to oblige. Much later, heads close together, hands entwined, they borrowed Maggie's jeep and drove back to Driston and Gwen's castle. There they crept into the back entrance, quiet as mice as to not wake anyone, where they fell into bed and began loving all over again. It was nearly noon by the time that Diagus and Chloe ventured below stairs, and when they did, much to Driston's irritation, they went straight to the kitchens, evidently famished. He could hear a passel of McFarley's banging about in there, putting together a late brunch. Driston shook his head and resumed pacing in the library, scarcely able to contain his impatience. The elderly McFarley buttled in, trying to find something he might bring his lordship, but the only thing his lordship wanted was his damn brother's attention. He'd been up since dawn, and already a dozen times this morning he'd stalked down the stairs. Yet, each time, Gwen had met him at the bottom and firmly turned him back toward the library. He'd heard him slip in last eve, as if he'd been able to fall asleep on the night that Diagus was to return, and had begun to rise from the bed to go to them, but Gwen had placed her hand on his arm. "Let them have tonight, love," she'd said. He'd growled, frustrated, eager to share his news, and discovered that they'd learned, and then she'd begun kissing him, and his mind had scattered away. It always did when she used that luscious mouth of hers on any part of him. The parts that she used it on last eve. He glanced at her. She was curled on the window seat beneath one of the library's bay windows. Rain spattered lightly against the glass. She'd been reading for the past hour, and now she was staring dreamily out the window. Her skin had the most unique, translucent radiance of a pregnant woman. Her breasts were full and tight, her belly heavily rounded with their children. Fierce elation and protectiveness flooded him, accompanied by that never-ending need to be holding her, touching her. As if sensing his gaze on her, she turned from the window and smiled at him. He dropped into an armchair near the fireplace and patted his thigh. "Bring your bonny self over here, wee English." Her smile deepened and her eyes sparkled. As slipped from the window seat, she warned him, "I might squish you." He snorted. "I do not think there's any danger of that, lass." But a few inches over 5 feet, even heavily pregnant, his wife could never be aught but a wee lass in his mind. He pulled her onto his lap and clasped his hands around her, holding her close. The day was overcast, rainy and chill, a perfect day for a cozy peat fire, and, in time, lulled by the combination of the woman in his arms and the comforts of home, he relaxed. He was nearly dozing when Diagus and Chloe finally finished eating and joined them. Gwen rose from his lap, and greetings and hugs were exchanged. "Sylvan and Nell said to give you their love," Chloe told them. Driston grinned, noting that Chloe's hair was still lightly damp from her shower. So was his brother's. 'Twas no wonder they'd not come down. Kelter men had to decide his penchant for making love in the shower or bath. Indoor plumbing was one of many luxuries of the 21st century that he wasn't sure how he'd live without. A shower? Delicious. Sex in the shower? Ugh, Life didn't get any better. Gwen beamed. Didn't you just love Sylvan and Nell? I was so envious that I couldn't go along and see them again. Nell gave me a letter for you, Gwen, Chloe said. It's upstairs. Do you want me to get it now? Gwen shook her head. Justin might die of impatience if I let you leave the room. We have news. But first, Justin interjected firmly, let's hear yours. He studied Diagus carefully. Through his eyes they were the color of deeply burnished copper, the outer edges of the irises rimmed with black. There was a sense of peace about him that hadn't been there before. Oh, aye, Justin thought. Love could indeed work miracles. He had no idea how long they'd spent in the past, but it was long enough that they'd fallen head over heels in love. Long enough that they were united as one in the uncertain future. While Diagus filled them in on what they discovered, he listened patiently. When Diagus told him of the chamber library beneath the study in Maggie and Christopher's castle, he had to grip the arms of his chair to prevent himself from leaping up and racing off to explore it. To touch and read the legendary compact, to discover their lost history. Finally, it was his turn to tell the news. These members of the Druid sect of the Dragar that you spoke of, Justin began. Oi, Diagus encouraged, then paused. We have one of them in our dungeon. Diagus shot to his feet. How did this come about? Have you questioned him? What did he tell you? He demanded. Easy, brother. He told me all. The base of their order's operation is in London, in a place called the Bellevue Building, on the Lower West Side. 'Twas he and his companion that were after Chloe in Manhattan. 'Twas his companion who leaped from your terrace. He followed you here, hoping to get another chance at Chloe. They were trying to provoke you to use magic and force the transformation. I'll kill the son of a bitch, Diagus snarled and began to move toward the door of the library. Sit, Chloe said, dashing after him and tugging him firmly. Let's hear the rest of it. You can kill him later. Bristling with unbridled fury, Diagus refused to move for a moment, then he snorted and followed her back to the sofa. You can kill him later, she said, almost absently. When he sank back down on the sofa beside her, she snuggled into his arms and patted him like one might soothe a rabid wolf. He shook his head, nonplussed. Sometimes, he mused, it might be nice if she were a wee bit intimidated by him. But not his mate. She feared nothing. He admitted, Justin smiled in grim satisfaction, under a bit of duress. Good. I hope it was excruciating. That the building is constructed atop a labyrinth of catacombs, and in those crypts is where all the records are kept. So far as he knows, the building is commonly occupied by no more than 3 or 4 men, and at night 'tis most oft but 2. Deep in the heart of it, the building has a security system, yet I believe 'tis not to be present a challenge to someone with your unique skills, brother. There are complex passkeys, and much to his dismay, he described to me precisely what we must do to pass them. To the best of his knowledge, they still believe you have no idea they exist, and that you do not know of the prophecy. Perfect. It should be simpler matter to break in late at night and search their records and histories. Did you ask if he knew a way to get rid of the 13? Aye, of certain I did. 'Tis one of the first things I asked. He indicated that there was a way, but he didn't know what it was. He overheard the master of their order, a man called Simon Barton Drew, express concern that you might discover it. I assure you, I probed him thoroughly, but the man had no idea what the method is. Then we need to find this Simon Barton Drew, and I do not give a damn if what harm we must do to him to discover what he knows. Chloe and Gwen nodded in with their agreement. So when do we leave? Gwen asked matter-of-factly. Diagus and Justin both skewered her with a glare. We dunno. Daigus said firmly. Oh, yes, we do, Chloe rebutted immediately. Daigus scowled. There's no way we're taking the two of you in there. Then just take us to London with you. Gwen managed to sound both soothing yet absurd. We'll stay in a hotel nearby, but we will not remain here while you two go tripsing off into danger. This is not negotiable. Justin shook his head. Gwen, I will not have you taking risks with either yourself or our born lass. With a thick bird tension. And you should trust that I wouldn't either, Gwen said levelly. I'm not going to let anything happen to our babies. Chloe and I will stay in the hotel, Justin. We're not stupid. I know there's not much a woman as pregnant as I am could do when it comes to stealthily breaking in and searching, but you can't just leave us here. If you tried to, we'd only follow you. Take us with you. Settle us safely in a hotel. You can't shut us out. We're a part of it, too. It would drive us both crazy sitting here and waiting. Either way, they're going to be waiting. Anyway. The debate went on for well over half an hour. In the end, the women prevailed, and the men reluctantly agreed to take them to London the following day. Because if Mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. His back, father, as is the woman. He's back, father, as is the woman, Hugh Barton Drew informed Simon, as he spoke softly into the cell phone. We saw them return late last night. Any idea where they were? None. And there's still no sighting of Trevor. No. But we can't get in the castle even if it weren't warded. I'm not certain it would be safe to try, he said quietly. Hushed tones were unnecessary as far from the castle as he and his brother were, watched through binoculars. But Daigus McKeltar made them uneasy. This Kelter castle, unlike the other one atop the mountain, was in a vast vale, and surrounding forest-covered hills provided excellent cover. Still, he felt exposed. His brother had complained of the same sensation. Report in to me every 2 hours. I want to be kept appraised of every move they make, Simon May said. Chapter 25. It was late at night, long after everyone was asleep, that Daigus slipped stealthily from the castle. The day that seemed to drag on endlessly, while he struggled to conceal from those he loved what he was planning. To keep his gaze mild, his importance in check, it had worn him down, comforting himself as if he were in complete agreement, betraying no telltale sign, every minute, to the brother who knew him well, that he had no intention of going along with the plan that they had spent the rainy afternoon meticulously formulating. The plan wherein they would all go to London and all be in jeopardy. During the latter part of the afternoon, while Chloe and Gwen had packed for their trip to London, the trip that was never going to happen, he'd gone down to the dungeon and interrogated the man from the sect of the Jagar himself. He'd used magic to ruthlessly strip the information from his mind. But as Justin had assured him, although the man knew there was some way to imprison the 13 and prevent the transformation, he did not know the specifics of it. That was a way definitely existed was enough to fill Daigus with a heady exhilaration and a seething impatience to see it done now. The four of them gathered for dinner in the great hall, and shortly thereafter he swept Chloe back up to bed, where they made love to her until she collapsed, replete in his arms. He'd hold her then, savoring the feel of her in his arms for nearly another hour before he'd finally left their bed. And now, as he stepped out into the night, he was ready. It was time to face the enemy and finish things once and for all. Alone. He would never permit any of the people that he loved to take the risk with them. 'Twas he who created the mess, and 'twould be he who fixed it. He was the best, solitary, unencumbered, the ghoulish ghost again, a sleek, dark wraith scarce visible to the human eye, and with no need to watch over his shoulder to protect someone else. He hadn't saved Dristan for Gwen once, only to lose one or both of them now, and he would never lose Chloe. He knew they would be furious, but with luck, it would be over before they even awakened, or at worst, shortly thereafter. He needed it this way, needed to know they were safe in the castle, so he could keep his mind focused on his goals with no distractions. He could penetrate the Dragar's sect headquarters, search their records, locate Simon and address, hunt him down, and peel from his mind the information he needed. The thought that he might, in a short time, be free of the exhausting battle that he'd been waging for so long was hard for him to comprehend. The idea that by morning he might be able to return to Chloe not more than a druid and a man seemed a dream too good to be true. But it wasn't. According to Trevor, and a mind so ruthlessly violated was incapable of lying, Simon knew how to return the ancient ones that prison from whence they came. The flight to London was short, though it took him several frustrating hours to locate the Bellevue building. He had not been in London before, with the exception of an airport, and it was confusing to him. He stood outside the unit building for some time, studying it from back, front, and all sides. It was a large warehouse constructed of stone and steel with 4 floors, but from what Trevor had confessed, that which he sought would be found below ground. He took slow, even breaths of the chill, foggy night air. Moving briskly, silently, he approached the building and worked the lock with a softly murmured phrase. That made twice today that he'd used magic, and he dare use it only sparingly henceforth. Even now, the beings within him were stirring. He could sense them reaching out as if trying to fathom their surroundings. He opened the door and slipped partly in, punching the code into the keypad. He was prepared. He had lifted all the knowledge he needed from Trevor's mind and committed it to memory. He knew every sequence of numbers, every alarm to circumvent, every passkey. Stepping across the threshold, he felt a sudden pinching pain in his chest, deep in the ridge of a muscle. He shrugged his shoulder, trying to work the kink out, but it didn't go away, and bemused, he glanced down. For a moment, the sight of a silver dart quivering in his chest simply baffled him. Then his vision swam, alarmingly, narrowed to a dim tunnel. Blinking, he stared into the dark room. "A tranquilizer," a cultured voice informed him politely. A few moments later, cursing viciously, Diagus crashed to the floor. He roused, he has no idea how long later, to the sensation of cool stone against his back. As his drug-induced stupor receded slowly, he became aware that he was securely restrained. He felt strange, but was unable to pinpoint exactly what it is. Something was different inside of him, mayhap the lingering effects of the tranquilizer, he decided. Without opening his eyes, he flexed minutely, testing his bonds. He was chained to a stone column several feet in diameter. Thick linked chains bound around his arms behind him, around the column's circumference. His ankles were chained together as well, bound again to the base of the column. Without calling upon magic, he could move naught but his head. Keeping his eyes closed, he listened, noting the different voices that spoke over the next few minutes, tallying the numbers of his enemy. 6, no more. Had they not drugged him, they would have never taken him, and if he could get free, he would have no problems escaping. He reached out with his druid senses, testing the strength of his chains. Blither in hell, he thought darkly. There was a binding spell on them. He poked at it lightly, testing its strength with magic, not wishing to use more than what was necessary, but instead a subtle, direct probing, a sudden, uncontrolled rush of power ripping through him, far more than he'd meant to use. more than he'd ever used in a single time before. He felt the instant response of the 13. They began murmuring in their incomprehensible languages, their voices buzzing like insects inside of his head. He was bombarded with sensation. Icy darkness, endless stretching of bickering amongst themselves, enforced eternal togetherness with no escape. Periods of lucidity, longer periods of madness, until finally there was nothing left but rage and hatred and an all-consuming thirst for vengeance. His whole body shuddered. 'Twas the strongest taste of them he'd gotten yet, and it was so revolting that had his hands been free, he suspected he would have clawed at his head in a futile effort to gouge them out of his skull. He realized two things now. The sect of the Dragar was more advanced in Druidry than he'd thought. To weave such a powerful spell into cold iron, and they'd given him something besides a mere tranquilizer. They'd given him some kind of drug that was impairing his ability to control the power within him. He was like a man who'd consumed too much whiskey, who could intentionally, a gentle caress, lash out with a killing blow out of sheer sloppiness. And he had no doubt that such a blow would turn him fully dark. He inhaled slowly, forcing his senses outward, away from the chaotic buzzing in his mind. He tasted the air, trying to envision the shape of the room, of the echo of the conversation. It seemed to be a low-ceilinged, long, where there was a faint odor of moss on stone. He had no idea how long he'd been unconscious. He was fair certain he was in the catacombs beneath the building. What a fool he'd been barging in, underestimating his foe. He acted rashly, driven by impatience and desperate to need to protect those he loved. Not once had it occurred to him that the sect of the Dragar might have been people watching him, reporting his every move. Apparently they had, but they'd certainly been ready for him. What was their plans? To use this deadly drug to force his transformation? He's coming around, someone said. He would have preferred they continued to think him unconscious, buying precious time for the effects of the drug to diminish. But evidently, though he'd remained motionless, he'd given himself away somehow. Perhaps his chest was rising and falling more deeply. He opened his eyes. "Ah, there you are," a tall, lean man with salt and pepper hair said, moving to stand before him. The man looked down at him for a long moment. "I'm Simon Barton Drew, master of the sect. This isn't quite how I had hoped to meet you. My apologies for the restraints, but for the time being, they are necessary. I assume Trevor is dead?" he inquired politely. "Trevor lives," Digus said, modulating his voice carefully. He would betray no sign of inner conflict to the man. "Unlike your order, the Kelter do not take life without cause. No matter how much he would wanted to have liked to." Simon circled the stone column. "Nor do we. All we've done was necessary to serve the purpose of the restoring of our rightful powers, to fulfill our destiny." "They were never your rightful powers. They were given by the Tuatha, and they were the Tuatha's to reclaim when it became evident man would abuse them." Simon gave a short bark of laughter. "Thus speaks the man who broke his own oaths. See it as you wish. No matter. You will lead us." "I will never fulfill the prophecy." "Aha! So you know of it. I wondered if you did. When did you find out? Did Trevor tell you? Not that I blame him, for I know what you're capable of. It's all here." He swept an arm behind him at piles of manuscripts and texts stacked carefully on dozens of shelves. "All that the Dragar can do, all they will teach us. The power to move through space and time, the power to open the realms. The Dragar you worship nearly destroyed the world once, trying to open the realms. What makes you think once they're free, they won't again? Why destroy the world when they can rule it?" Simon countered. I believe we can determine that what went wrong the last time they tried to go after the Tuatha. Our world is far more advanced now than it was then, and there are so many faithful followers waiting to welcome them. What makes you think they have any intentions of becoming part of your little order? Why would they remain with you? Diagus goaded. What do you mean? The briefest flicker of unease flashed in the man's face. If they can travel to time, what is there to prevent them from returning to their own century? What do you think they want more than anything? To reclaim their power, a chance to live again, to take their rightful place in the world. Diagus tisked mockingly. Though he couldn't understand their language and didn't know what the Dragar's intentions were, Simon didn't know that. Sowing doubts could be a useful weapon. If he could keep him talking long enough, mayhap enough for the drug's effects to pass, that he could risk probing Simon's mind. They want bodies, Simon. No. They want bodies, Simon, and they will have the power to return to their own. Once you release them, how will you stop them from going back? You won't be able to control them. They may destroy your order the moment I change. What use have they for you? They'll return to their century, keep the war from happening, and utterly rewrite the past 4,000 years of history. Like as not, none of us will ever be born by the time they're done changing things. The man in the room looked decidedly uneasy. Uneasy was good. Violent deception would be even better. You'll be releasing the power that you can't possibly begin to understand and have no hope of mastering. Dias gave him a chilling smile. After a tense silence, Simon waved a dismissive hand. Enough. I'm not going to fall for your ruse. The Dragar would not try to return because they would run the risk of imprisoning again. They would never risk that. So you say. When in truth you know nothing about them. I do. Simon's jaw set, and he motioned the two of the men standing by. I will not be swayed from the course of the prophecy. It is my sworn duty to fulfill it, and I may not know as much about the Dragar as I'd like, but I do know much about you. Bring her, he ordered. Diagus went rigid. Her who? He nearly roared. There was no way, he told himself. Chloe was safe in sleeping within the castle guarded warded walls. He was so very wrong. When they returned a few moments later, his gut clenched. Nay. Oh, nay, lass. Oh, I killed her, Simon mocked. A lovely woman. Isn't she? We tried to get her in Manhattan, but fear not. You may have all of her you want once you've yielded to the inevitable. I suspect the Dragar will be hungry for a woman after 4,000 years. The man roughly half-dragged, half-carried Chloe forward. Her hands and feet were bound and her face ashen, streaked with tears. I'm so sorry, Diagus, she gasped. I woke up when I heard the car door slam and I ran outside trying to catch you. One of the men cuffed her into silence. Then every muscle in Diagus's body screamed. He closed his eyes, fighting in the dark storm rising in him. I am a man, and a Kelter. I will not lash out blindly, he told himself over and over again, with several moments before he managed to open them again, and when he did, their gazes locked. I love you, she mouthed. I'm so sorry. He shook his head, rejecting her apologies, hoping she understood that he was saying no apology was necessary. It was his fault, not hers. I love you too, lass, he shaped the words silently. How touching, Simon said dryly. He motioned the men holding Chloe to bring her forward, stopping them a half-dozen paces from the column to which Diagus was bound. Having a private plane has its uses. She was here before you even landed in London, and now my men will kill her unless you'd care to prevent it. Being bound should present no obstacle for a man with such power." "You son of a bitch!" Daigus strained violently against the chains, but to no avail. Without magic, he wasn't going anywhere. Rage consumed him, accompanied by the fierce temptation to use the most horrific power at his disposal. He could taste the potency of the Ancient Ones piling up in the back of his throat, begging to be freed. The words that brought death coiled on the tips of his tongue. He wanted blood, and the being inside him were lusting to spill it. Simon had planned his strategy well. He'd drugged Daigus so he wouldn't be able to control the amount of magic he'd used. That taken captive, the woman Daigus loved more than life itself, and was now going to kill her, unless Daigus used magic to prevent it. And if he used magic to save her, he would transform. It was inevitable, he realized with a peculiar detachment. This was it. He was backed into a corner with no way out. There was no way he would permit Chloe to be harmed, ever. She was his mate. She held his Selvar. His life was her shield. For a split second, a curiously suspended instant in time, it was as if he were there in the catacombs, yet not there. His mind slipped to a quiet place where memories flashed in swift conjunction. He was seeing Chloe for the first time, standing in the misting rain on a bustling street in Manhattan. He was discovering her beneath his bed. He was feeling the lushness of his lips that he'd stolen that first kiss. He was feeding her bites of salmon, listening to hover incessantly away about some obscure tomb, her eyes sparkling, watching her puff on a fat cigar. He was seeing her sleepy, sexy eyes when he'd brought her to her first peek on the airplane, making love to her in the sparkling pool beneath an endless blue sky in his beloved Highlands, spilling inside of her, becoming part of her, watching as she perched on a chair and practiced saying that she loved him into a shield, then turning to shout it at him, saying it again after he told her his darkest secrets, remaining steadfastly at his side. And in that strange, quiet moment, he realized that he'd not broken his oath, that he'd not gone through the stones to save Tristan. He would never have met Chloe. Iconic, he mused, that his fate had required his own fall to lead him to the woman who'd been his salvation in so many ways. He had been given the choice to go back in time and choose not to break his oath and never meet Chloe Xanders. He would have resolutely walked into the stones and done it all over again, with full awareness that it would lead to this moment. Simply to have the joy of loving Chloe for what time he'd had. From that quiet place, his mind glided swiftly to another, to the bitterly cold night he danced upon his ice-slicked terrace wall. He'd done it because he'd always known that he could end it by all by dying. Simple solution, really. No vessel, no resurrection. Mate, endgame, and match. A part of him had been so weary of fighting, but he'd resolved that eve to continue fighting, and related thoughts of suicide to his arsenal of the last sort, loathing in the notion of it. Then he'd met Chloe, who gave him 1,000 reasons to live. He smiled bitterly. He couldn't call forth the magic necessary to free her and to see her safe without also releasing the Dragar, which put him in an impossible position. He would never usher in that epoch of darkness more brutal than mankind had ever known, of which the prophecy foretold. There was no telling how many millions might die. What if those words he'd taunted Simon with truly were the 13 planned to do? What if they did intend to go back in time, mayhap fight the war all over again, mayhap win this time? It would utterly change 4,000 years of mankind's history. Man might no longer even exist in the present times by the time they were done. Nay, his choices, his chances, had they all been exhausted? Oh, love, he grieved. It wasn't supposed to end this way. When he opened his eyes, it was to discover that they'd stuffed a gag in Chloe's mouth. Her aquamarine eyes sparkled with tears. Cut her. Show him her blood. Daigus bit down on his tongue, filling his mouth with bitter metallic taste. He knew he had no time it to perfection. Had to time it to perfection. He had to make certain he inflicted a sufficiently mortal wound on himself that he would die before the transformation was complete, but not before the sect members were dead and Chloe was free. He steeled himself to act with flawless resolution. A single moment of hesitation could undo him. He had to be 100% committed to dying. And that was the damned hardest thing to be when looking at Chloe. One of the men drew a blade over the skin of her neck. A crimson droplet welled. Chloe writhed in her arms, bucking and struggling. Now, he told himself, even as he whispered a goodbye to his mate. Grief flooded him so acutely, so intensely, that he tossed his head back and howled from the very depths of his soul. Then, for the first time since the eves that they've claimed possession, he dropped his guard and stopped resisting the 13. He opened himself up to them. He invited them. He embraced them. The response was instantaneous. Power, cunning, and madness flooded him. He was suddenly bombarded with bits and pieces of 13 lives, filled with the phenomenal force of 12 men and one woman whose lust for life had been so intense that they wanted to live forever, but far surpassing any sense of them as individuals was their untied rage and hatred for their gallowers, a driving, incessant determination to see the Tuatha Dé destroyed, even if they had to destroy all the realms in the process. As they swarmed into him, he ripped into Simon's mind, brutally probing. Though the answers would be of no use to him now, he still wanted to know. He wanted to know how things may have played out differently had he acted less rashly, been wiser. The answer he discovered made him laugh. The irony of it was rich. He'd come tonight with so much hope, yet he knew that even had Chloe not been taken, this had always been his only alternative. Simon indeed knew the way to re-imprison the 13. Daigus had to die. Chloe struggled with her assailant's arms, blinking back tears. She had been such an idiot running out of the castle, but damn him for trying to do it alone. How was she to know men would jump on her the moment she walked outside? She'd not even gotten the opportunity to scream and warn Dustin and Gwen when she had been taken. She chewed desperately on her gag, but it was no use. She couldn't make so much as a whimper. Oh, Daigus, she thought, helplessly watching him. He looked at her, and his lips moved, and she couldn't make out what he said. Then suddenly he made a sound of raw agony, and the dark head slammed back onto the stone column with so much force that Chloe nearly stopped breathing, screaming silently inside. His neck arched, his body strained as if being pulled on a rack. The man called Simon cried out and collapsed to the floor, clutching his head. Daigus laughed, and the sound chilled Chloe's blood. Daigus would never make such a twisted, dark sound. Shaking violently, she watched as his head tipped slowly down. Then she saw his eyes, and she choked on the gag. They were almost fully black. A tiny sliver of white rimmed them, hardly there at all. She ceased struggling, frozen by horror. An icy gale rushed into the chambers, scattering books from the shelves, toppling tables and chairs, whipping sheets and parchment through the air. Suddenly, the two men holding her were gone. The knife at her neck shot away through the air, and she lost sight of it amid the flying debris. The ropes at her wrists and ankles snapped, and the gag was abruptly torn from her mouth. As if from a far distance she heard Daigus's voice, but not quite his voice. It was more like a dozen voices layered upon each other, telling her to close her eyes, telling her that she would see and hear nothing until commanded otherwise. And she knew that he had done something to her, used some kind of magic on her, because suddenly she was blind and deaf. Panicking by the loss of her senses, she dropped to the floor and held very still. That time, this sightless silence seemed to go on for an eternity. The only sensation left to her was feeling the chilling caress of that bitter, dark wind. She huddled on the floor, refusing to contemplate what must be going on, refusing to believe what she thought she'd seen before all hell had broken loose. She knew Digas. He would never do such a thing, not even for her. He was too honorable at the core. He would never choose her life over the fate of the world. Then why had it looked like he was becoming the Dragar? Chapter 26. Silence was all Chloe heard when she could hear again, though it wasn't exactly silence, for in contrast to the other vacuum of deafness, silence was a mishmash of white noise, a faint hum of fluorescent lighting, the soft push of air from the dehumidifiers installed to protect the ancient texts. She'd never been so grateful for such simple, comforting sounds in her life. It had been terrifying to be stripped of the ability to both see and hear, but she still couldn't see. She suffered another moment of absolute panic before realizing that her eyes were closed. Opening them, she pushed herself shakily from the floor into a sitting position. Her gaze flew to the stone column, but Digas was no longer chained to it. Frantically, she skimmed the room. Once, twice, 3 times she looked through the wreckage and jerked her head in abject denial. There was blood all over the place, puddles of it. Still more sprayed across the tables and chairs, but the chaos of books and papers on the floor. Yet more blood on the stone column, and there wasn't a single other person, not even a body, in the room with her. Time is a companion that goes with us on a journey. It reminds us to cherish each moment, because it will never come again. What we leave behind is not as important as how we have lived. Jean-Luc Picard, Captain of the Enterprise. Chapter 27. I don't want you to go, Gwen said for what Chloe was certain must be 100th time. Please, stay with us, Chloe. Chloe shook her head wearily. Over the past 2 weeks, she and Gwen had grown close, which both soothed and chafed, for it made Chloe think about how incredible her life could have been if things had worked out differently. She had no doubt that she and Digas would have gotten married, remained in Scotland, and bought a house near Gwen and Dresden. She and Gwen were similar in many ways, and in time Gwen would have become a sister she never had. What a perfect, blissful dream that would never have been. Living in the Highlands, surrounded by family, married to the man that she loved. But everything had gone so damn wrong. And in those things would never be, and her growing affection for the brilliant, nurturing woman who stayed tirelessly at her side since that terrible night had begun to hurt more than it helped. I've stayed as long as I can, Gwen, Chloe said, continuing her grimly determined march toward the security gate. They were in the airport, and she was desperate to be in the air, to escape the so many painful reminders. If she didn't get out of here soon, she was afraid she might start screaming and never stop. She couldn't look at Dresden one more time, couldn't bear being in the castle Digas built, couldn't bear being in Scotland without him even one more second. It had been 2 weeks since the horrible night that she'd been awakened by the sound of a car door slamming, 2 weeks since she'd run outside after him, only to be taken hostage by sect members who'd been waiting for just an opportunity. 2 weeks since she'd fled, sobbing from the heart of the catacombs, stumbling out of the Bethuel building to call Gwen and Justin from a payphone. 2 weeks since they'd joined her in London and searched every inch of the damned building. At first, when Gwen and Justin had taken her back to Castle Kelter, she'd been in shock, incapable of talking. She huddled in a darkened bedchamber, dimly aware that they were hovering nearby. Eventually, she managed to tell them what happened. The part of it she'd seen, when she curled in bed, replaying it over and over in her mind, trying to fathom what had really transpired, realizing that they would never know for sure. All they knew for certain was that Diagus was gone. For 2 weeks, Chloe lived in a kind of excruciating suspension, a bundle of tension and grief, and treacherous hope. It wasn't as if she actually seen his dead body. So nothing. 2 weeks of waiting, praying, hoping against hope. Each day of watching Gwen and Justin together had been the purest kind of hell. Justin touched Gwen with Diagus's hands. He lowered Diagus's face to kiss her. He spoke with Diagus's deep, sexy voice. And he wasn't Diagus. He wasn't hers to hold, though he looked like he would be. He was Gwen's, and Gwen was pregnant, and Chloe wasn't. She knew because Gwen had persuaded her to take an EPT a few days ago, arguing that if she tested positive, it would give her something to hold on to. Unfortunately, she hadn't got to the cheery news that Gwen had gotten 7 months ago. Her test results had been negative. Like her life, a great, big, fat negative. I don't think you should be alone, Gwen protested. She tried to smile, reassuring, but from the look on Gwen's face, she suspected that she'd only manage a frightening baring of teeth. I'll be okay, Gwen. I can't stay here any longer. I can't stand seeing... She trailed off, not wanting to hurt Gwen's feelings. I understand, Gwen said, wincing. She'd felt much the same when she thought Justin was her forever lost to her, and she met his descendants. She could only imagine what Chloe must feel each time she looked at Diagus's twin, and Chloe couldn't have promised of babies to cling that she had had. The worst of it was that there were no answers. Diagus was simply gone. Gwen had clung on to hope, too, in those first few days until Justin had confided that since the night his brother had disappeared, he had not been able to feel the unique twin bond that he and Diagus always shared. They decided not to tell Chloe that just yet. Gwen still wasn't sure they'd made the right decision. She knew a part of Chloe was still hoping. We'll be coming to Manhattan in a few weeks, Chloe, Gwen told her, hugging her tightly. They clung to each other for a time. Then Chloe tore herself away and practically ran to the security gate, as if she couldn't get out of Scotland fast enough. Gwen wept for her as she watched her go. The maybe game, Chloe swiftly came to realize, was the cruelest game of all, far worse from the what might have been game. A maybe game was parents who left for dinner and a movie and never came home again. The maybe game was closed casket funeral in a 4-year-old's imagination when confronting a sleek, glossy boxes at the attendant, bewildering rituals of death. The maybe game was an empty, freaking room full of blood and no answers. Maybe Diagus had used the power of Jagar to free her, to kill the sect members and magically transport their bodies elsewhere so she wouldn't be confronted with the horror, where they'd been killed themselves to make certain the prophecy would never be fulfilled. That was what Justin believed, and deep down inside her heart, that's what Chloe believed as well. In her heart, she knew Diagus would never risk freeing the ancient evil to walk the earth again, not even for her. It had nothing to do with love. It had everything to do with the fate and the future of the entire world. She'd endlessly replayed the moment in her mind when the knife had whipped away from her neck and gone hurling through the air. It had gone in his direction. But maybe, another insidious little voice kept insisting, he and the sect of the Jagar had vanished one another, inadvertently, and they would all come back. Eventually. Stranger things could happen. Stranger things happened on Buffy all the time. Maybe they were locked somewhere in a mortal combat or something. Maybe, her mind tortured her, he's still alive somewhere, somehow. That was the most excruciating maybe of all. How many years had she believed that her parents would one day walk through the front door again? When Grandad had come to take her to Kansas, she'd been terrified to go. She still remembered shrieking at him the time she couldn't leave when Mommy and Daddy come home. They won't know where to find me. For years she'd clung to the agonizing hope, until she'd finally been old enough to understand what death was. "Oh, Xander," she whispered, "you can't play the maybe game. You know what it does to you." She had no idea how many days she'd huddled in her tiny apartment, completely withdrawing from the world. She didn't answer the phone, she didn't check her emails or mail. She rarely even stirred from bed. She passed her time mentally reliving every precious moment she and Digus had spent together. I know that feeling all too well. Hey, Daniel! She had the most incredible month of her life. She had met a man of her dreams and fallen head over heels in love. She had the promise of a blissful future. She'd held everything that she'd ever wanted right there in the palm of her hands, and now she had nothing. How was she supposed to go on? How was she supposed to face the world? To get dressed, to maybe brush her hair, to go out on the sidewalk, to see lovers talking and walking and laughing with each other? Impossible. And so the days crept by in a bleak fog, until one morning she woke up obsessed with wanting the artifacts he'd given her in her apartment, needing to hold the scando, to wrap her fingers around it in the same places his had once rested, which meant leaving her apartment. She tried to think of some other way to get them, but there was none. Only she could access the safety deposit box. Numbly, she dragged herself to the shower, got sort of wet, then sort of dry, then stumbled to the suitcase she hadn't quite unpacked. She tugged on rumpled clothes that may or may not have matched. Frankly, she didn't care. At least she wasn't naked and wouldn't get arrested. She would have forced herself to speak to people, something she had no desire to do, and took a cab to the bank. Within a short time, she was ushered to a private room and her safety deposit box. She looked at it for a long while, just standing there staring, trying to summon the immense energy necessary to root around in her purse for her wallet. Eventually, she rummaged about the key and unlocked the long metal box. She opened it and froze, staring. Atop her short sword, scando, Celter brooch, and intricately etched first-century armband, lay an envelope with her name on it, in Diagus's handwriting. She closed her eyes, frantically shutting the sight of it out. She hadn't prepared for that. Merely seeing his handwriting made her heart feel as if it was breaking all over again. She took several low, deep breaths, trying to calm herself. Opening her eyes, she reached for the envelope with trembling hands. What on earth would he have written to her so many weeks ago, when they'd only known each other 5 days before she left for Scotland with him? She untucked the flap and withdrew a single sheet of paper. "Chloe, lass, if I'm not here with you now, I'm beyond this life, for 'tis the only way I'll ever let you go." She flinched, her whole body jerking. Several long moments passed before she managed herself to keep reading. "I hope I loved you well, sweet, for I know even now you are my brightest shining star. I knew it the moment I saw you. Ah, lass, you so adore your artifacts. This thief covets but one priceless treasure. You, Digus." She squeezed her eyes shut from fresh pain lanced through her. The knot in her throat swelled, the burning behind her eyes excruciating. Yet, still, she refused to cry. There was perfectly good reason that she hadn't cried since the night he disappeared. She knew that if she cried, it would mean that he was really gone. which also seemed to imply in perhaps less than logical way that as long as she didn't cry, there was hope. Oh, God, she could picture him. She could see them both standing at the bank that day. He was tall, dark, and too gorgeous for words. He was so excited, so thrilled and nervous, so fascinated by him, so distrustful, too, of the dastardly, impossibly sexy, ghoulish ghost. She'd watched every move he made to be certain he really put her precious artifacts in the box before he locked it and gave her the key. Still, he managed to slip a letter in at the last moment without her seeing it. Even then, he wanted her. Even then. He'd said, even then, that he would never let her go. Ma'am, a brisk voice interrupted. My apologies for disturbing you, but they just informed me that you arrived. Is Mr. McKelter with you? Chloe opened her eyes slowly. The bank manager was standing in the doorway. She wasn't ready to talk to anyone yet, so she shook her head. Well then, he asked me to give this to you, should you come to collect the contents of the box without him. He handed her a set of keys. He said he wanted you to have... He shrugged, regarding her with open curiosity. Whatever it is that these keys open. He said it was paid for, and if you didn't wish to retain ownership, you could sell it. His expression was conviction that it would keep you quite comfortable for the rest of your life. He scrutinized her intently. Mr. McKelter has fairly sizable accounts in our bank. Might I inquire as to his intentions about those? Chloe took the keys with trembling hand. They were the keys to his penthouse. She shrugged to indicate she had no idea. Are you all right, ma'am? You look pale. Are you feeling sick? Could I get you a glass of water? Or a soft drink or something? She shook her head again. She tucked the letter in her pocket and slipped a carefully wrapped skiando into her purse. The rest of the artifacts she would leave in the bank until she had what she felt was a safe place to keep them. They would never be sold. She would not part with so much as one precious memory. She eyed the keys, feeling strangely numb. How carefully he planned. How far ahead he'd been looking. Even then, leaving her his penthouse, as if she could ever bear to live there, or sell it, or even think about it. Ma'am, I've noticed that we have no next of kin listed for Mr. McKelter's files. Oh, hush. Just hush, would you? Chloe finally managed, pushing past him. She was dying inside, and all she cared about was whether the bank might lose Diagus. All he cared about was whether his bank might lose Diagus's money. It was more than she could stand. She left both the box and the bank manager without a backward glance. She wandered the city for a time, pushing blindly through the masses of people with no concept of where she was walking. Head down, she walked while the sun passed the noon hour, descending behind the skyscrapers, and slipped to the horizon. She walked until she was too exhausted to take another step. Then she slumped down on the bench. She couldn't bear the thought of going back to her apartment. She couldn't bear the thought of going to Diagus's penthouse. She couldn't bear the thought of being anywhere, or even being, for that matter. Yet, she mused, perhaps it would help. Perhaps merely being surrounded by his things, smelling him on his pillow again, touching his clothes, would be agonizing. At complete odds with herself, she got up and began walking aimlessly again. Night had fallen and full moon graced the sky by the time Chloe found herself entering the elegant foyer of Diagus's building. She hadn't exactly made the decision to go there. She just simply walked until her feet had taken her someplace. So, she thought dismally, here I am, ready or not. She trudged past the security desk, mumbling, waving keys at them. They shrugged, and they really should be fired, she thought as the keys of the elevator to the 43rd floor. When she stepped into the anteroom, her legs got shaky, and in her mind she was reliving it all over again. The first day that she had stood at his door, clutching the third book of Menonon, calling the men she was to deliver it to in every nasty name that she could think of, worrying that some bimbo might damage the tomb, scoffing over the gold hinges, entering his home, seeing the claymore hanging above the fireplace, the artifact that had lured her to her destiny, getting caught beneath his bed, pretending to be a French maid, being kissed by him that first time. Oh, what she wouldn't give to be able to go back in time and live it all over again. She'd settle for any one of those days. And if she had to do it all over again, she'd never resist his seduction. She'd drink greedily of each moment. But such a wish was futile. Neither she nor anyone else was going back in time again. Justin had told her that the night that Justin disappeared, he'd felt the bridge in the circle of stones go dead. He'd said it was as if an energy he'd sensed all his life was simply gone. The next day, he and Christopher had discovered that the tablets that held the sacred formulas were almost also gone, as was their recall of the ones they'd committed to memory as part of their training. Whatever Digas had done that night, he accomplished one thing he'd wanted. The Kelter no longer bore the duty of guarding the secret of time travel. They were finally free of the immense responsibility and temptation, able at last to live simpler lives. How Digas would have loved that, and she thought with a sad smile. He wanted nothing more than to be a simple man, to wear his clan colors again, and though he'd never said it, she'd known he'd wanted children, wanted his own family as much as she had. How could life have cheated me like this, she wanted to scream, steeling herself for the onslaught of yet more painful memories. She unlocked the door. Wonder of wonders, he'd actually locked it when he left, and pushed it open. She went straight to the fireplace and ran her fingers over the cool metal of the claymore. She had no idea how long she stood there in the dark, bathed only by the faint light of the full moon spilling on the wall of the window. But eventually she tossed her purse to the floor, dropped down on the sofa. Later she would brave the rest of his penthouse. Later she would drag herself up to his magnificent bed and fall asleep, wrapped up in the scent of him. Chloe, lass, if I'm not here with you now, I'm beyond this life, for it is the only way that I'll ever let you go. And there it was. He said it himself in the letter he'd left her. Chloe had made small, helpless, choking sound, and finally, the tears came in a hot rush. He was dead. He was really, truly gone. She curled into a tight knot on the sofa and wept. Y'all know me, I cry at commercials, so fuck it. Chapter 28. Chloe was awakened some time later by an unfamiliar, persistent noise. It took her several minutes to pinpoint the source, to understand that the scrabbling sound was coming from the door of the penthouse. Rubbing her eyes, she pushed herself into a sitting position on the sofa. She cried herself to sleep, and her eyes were swollen, her face crusty with tears. She peered into the darkness toward the door and listened intently. Oh God, she thought, horrified. It sounded like someone was trying to break in. She listened a few more moments. Yes, that was it. She could hear metallic grating as someone tried to pick the lock. She counted her blessings that she would bestirred herself from grief enough to flip the inner lock when she'd come in. Oh, for heaven's sake, she said, suddenly exasperated. What is this? My year of misery? Is every bad thing that could possibly happen to me going to? She was not going to be victimized again. Period. Chloe Xanders had entirely enough. There was only so much a girl could tolerate. She was suddenly dangerously furious at whoever it was outside that door daring to mess up her life even further. How dare anyone give her any more grief? Dimly aware that she might not be acting quite rationally, but beyond caring, she slipped from the sofa, snatched the claymore from the prongs above the hearth, and crept toward the door. She briefly contemplated pounding on it in hopes of scaring the intruder away, but swiftly decided that as isolated as the penthouse was, the intruder might break in anyway, and she would have to sacrifice her advantage of surprise. So she stood quietly behind the door and waited. It wasn't long before she heard the clicks as the tumbler slipped and the lock turned. Sucking in a shallow breath, she balanced on the balls of her feet, crouching low for a solid stance. Raised the heavy metal sword with both hands. The door opened slowly and a dark shape slipped in. Swiftly, and perhaps harder than she intended, Chloe whipped the blade of the sword to his throat. She heard a swift intake of air, as suspected. As sharp as the blade, she'd cut him. Good, she thought. Oh, Chloe, lass, please put down the blade, Digus said softly. Chloe screamed. Kelter mates never come easily to their men. Some travel distances too fast and strange to fathom. Others travel but a short path through a far distance in their hearts. Most resist every step of the way, yet for each Kelter, one woman will make that journey. 'Tis up to the Kelter to claim her. Sylvan lay the tiny tomb he'd found in the chamber library upon his lap. It was the only tomb he'd risked removing from the chamber before sealing it. Now ensconced in what had been his bedchamber and private sanctuary. The tower library, 103 steps above the castle proper. He'd finished reading it. The book did not name its scribe, as did most in a request for a blessing upon who'd scribed the words within, and was comprised of only a few tiny dozen sheets of parchment. Yet those few sheets, in compendium of the mating of the Kelter males, had been fascinating. And why haven't you claimed your mate, old man? To answer that was complicated, he brooded, glancing about the tower chamber. Fat pillars of candles scattered across several small tables burned brightly, flickering in the warm night breeze. He smiled, looking around at his peaceful haven. As a lad, he delighted in everything about the tower. Spiraling stairs, the stone walls and their myriad cracks and crevices covered with thick tapestries. The breathtaking beauty of the view from the tall windows in the spacious circular room. As an old man, he found it no less enchanting. He'd sat in the same deep chair, gazing out into the night as a man as mere 40 of years, and then 2, now 3, plus a few odd ones. He knew every wrinkle and rise of the land beyond the window. As much as he loved it, however, the solitude he'd sought as his salvation had in time become his prison, and he'd been more than ready to leave it a few years ago, when he'd wed Nell and moved down into the Castle Prosper. Still, there were evenings like this one, when he craved the lofty heights and quiet place to think. Digus and Chloe had left nearly a moon before, and he'd wondered how much time would have to pass before he finally accepted that he would never know what had become of his son. Though he believed Digus would do aught that he must have been done, not knowing the final outcome would plague him to the end of his days. And Nellie, too. The atmosphere in the castle had been somber indeed since they'd gone. Nellie, how she blessed his life. Without her, he'd have lost both his sons and been living alone high atop the Kelter mountain. Anon, he would blow out the candles and make his way down the winding stairs. He would go first to the nursery where their sons would be slumbering by now. He would sit beside them as he did every eve and marvel over them. Marvel over the second chance at life he had gotten when he least expected it. He flipped open the tomb to the page where his finger held the place. The exchange of the binding vows will seal their hearts together for all eternity, and once mated, they can never love another. And that was the crux of his problem. He'd not fully claimed his mate because of the age difference betwixt them. He knew that he would die before her, possibly long before her. And then what? She would remarry because he was gone? She would spend the next score or two of years alone? The thoughts of her lying with another man made him nigh crazed, yet the thought of her lying alone in a bed for so many years made him equally crazed. Nellie should be loved, cherished, petted, and caressed. She should be savored, and 'twas impossible conundrum. It should be her choice, his conscience prodded. I'll think on it, he grumbled. And if you die before you finish thinking on it? Scowling, his lips, he slipped the tomb into one of the clever pouches Nellie had stitches for him inside the blue robes he favored, and was about to rise when he became aware of a presence in the room, standing just behind his shoulder. He went motionless, reaching out with his Druid senses to identify the intruder, but whoever or whatever it was that stood behind him defied his comprehension. Sit, Kelter, a silvery lisping voice said. He sat. He wasn't certain if he'd chosen to comply, or if her voice had robbed him of it well. As he sat, tensely waiting, a woman stepped forward from the shadows behind him. Nay. A being. Wonderingly, he cocked his head, staring up at her. The censure was so brilliant, so lovely, that he could scarce gaze upon her. She had eyes of an iridescent hue, colors impossible to name, hair of spun silver, a delicate, elfin, inhumanly beautiful face. He suddenly wondered if he'd gotten a bit of bad beef for dinner and was suffering some inertia of the mind induced by poison digestion. Then a worse fear gripped him. One of that made his head feel alarmingly light and his blood pound too fast inside of his chest. Mayhap 'twas his time, and this was death, for she was certainly beautiful enough to lure any man into that great unknown that lay beyond. He could hear his own breath coming too fast and harsh. Could feel his hands going curiously tingly, as if they were about to go numb. A cold sweat broke out onto his skin. I cannot die now, he thought dimly. I haven't claimed Nellie. He wouldn't be able to bear it, he thought, blinking enormously heavy eyelids. They might never find each other again. He might be forced to suffer 100 lives without her. 'Twould be the purest hell. Aobiel, Queen of the Tuatha De Danann, bid you greeting, Kelter. His vision blurred alarmingly, and his last thought before the stress of the moment temporarily leached him of his wits was relief that he wasn't dying, and fury at himself for missing even a second of what he surely was the most thrilling event of his life. The legendary Tuatha De Danann had come, and what did the Grand Kelter Lord do? Fainted like a willy-nilly peon. A few minutes later, Chloe was sitting on the sofa with her head between her knees, trying desperately to breathe. Daigus was at her feet, his hands wrapped around her calves. Les, let me get a paper bag. You're hyperventilating. Don't you dare leave me, she clutched at his shoulders. I do not plan to leave you ever again, love. But I'm going to kitchen for a bag. Try to relax, sweet. Chloe nearly screamed again out of sheer frustration. Relax. As if she needed to hold him, to kiss him, to demand to be told what in what world was going on. She couldn't get a deep enough breath to manage anything. Standing there at the door when she heard his voice slicing through the darkness, she nearly fainted. The sword had clattered from her suddenly lifeless hands. Her knees had turned to butter. Her lungs had simply stopped functioning properly. She thought hiccups were awful, but then she'd take over hyperventilating over it any day. And she'd cut him. There was a thin line of blood on his neck. She tried to dab at it, but he caught both her hands with one of his, pressed them lightly to her lap, then began moving toward the kitchen. She craned her head sideways and watched him go. How could this be? How was he alive? Oh, God, he was alive! She couldn't take her eyes off of him, twisted around, following his progress, not letting him out of her sight for a minute. He was here. He was really here. He was real. She touched him. She knew from how ashen his face was that her inability to get a deep breath was scaring him. It was scaring her, too, so she forced herself to concentrate on the unknotting inside. By the time he returned with the paper, the bag, although she was still trembling visibly, she was managing complete breaths. She stared up at him, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. How? How is this possible? Flinging herself into his arms. Oh, lass, he purred, catching her in his embrace. He ducked his head and brushed his lips to hers. Once, twice, a dozen times. I thought I lost you forever, Chloe, he groaned. You? So did I. More frantic kisses, deep and hungry. She locked her hands about his neck, savoring the solidity of him, the warm press of his body against hers, a thing that she thought that she'd never get to feel again. Finally, Diagus murmured against her lips, How did you get here, Aless? How did you get back from Scotland so quickly? Quickly? Diagus, I've been here for 3.5 weeks since you disappeared. Just thinking about those awful weeks. Made her enough to start crying again. He gazed down at her, stunned. 3.5? Ah, so that's what the Queen meant, he exclaimed. The Queen? What Queen? What happened? Where have you been? And why are you picking the lock? Why didn't you just... Oh, she broke off and gazed deep into his exotic, sensual golden eyes. Golden. Oh, Diagus, she breathed. They're gone, aren't they? You're not just alive. You're free, aren't you? He flashed her a dazzling smile and laughed exultantly. Aye, lass, they're gone. Forever. As for picking the lock, since they're gone, I no longer know their spells. I'm afraid my thieving days are over, lass. Will you be having me as a little more than a man? A simple Celt or Druid, not more. Oh, I'll have you, Diagus McKelter, Chloe said fervently. I'll have you any way I can get you. It took dozens of kisses before she was finally calm enough and convinced enough that he was real. She let him pull her down onto his lap on the sofa and tell her what happened. When Sylvan regained consciousness and stirred in his chair, the Queen was sitting across from him, watching him intently. You're real, he managed to say. She looked mildly amused. I was recently drawn to my attention that perhaps we should not have left you so completely unguided. That perhaps you'd begun to think that we weren't real. I was convinced. I am now. I wasn't convinced. I am now. What are you precisely? Sylvan asked. That would be difficult to explain in your language. I could show you, but you didn't fare so well with this form, so I think not. Sylvan stared at her, trying to commit every detail of her to his memory. Your son is free, Kelter. Sylvan's heart leapt. Diagus triumph over the Jagar. Does he succeed in re-imprisoning them? In a matter of speaking, suffice to say, he proved himself. And he lives. Is he with Chloe? I gave him back to the woman who chose him as her consort. He can never return to this century. Already time has been altered more than is wise. Sylvan's mouth opened and closed several times as he tried to decide what to say. Nothing remotely intelligent occurred to him, so he finally settled for a simple, "Thank you for coming to tell me this." He was utterly flummoxed that the queen of the legendary race had bothered to come to tell him. "I didn't come to tell you this. You appeared weak upon awakening. I thought to increase your strength with glad tidings. We have work to do." "We do?" His eyes widened. "There is a small matter of a broken contract. Broken in this century on the Kelter side. It must be resealed here and now." I'm almost done. Let me finish. "So you did take the knife from my neck," Chloe said. Wait, did I miss a page? "Ah," he said. "So you did..." Yeah, damn it. Okay. "So you did take the knife from my neck," Chloe said, sniffling and wiping her eyes with a tissue. He told her everything, how the sect of the Dragar had drugged him with the potion and then made it impossible for him to control the use of magic. How he'd realized that when they'd brought her in, that he had only one choice left. And as she and Justin had both suspected, Diagus had been honorable to the last. He tried to kill himself. "You were going to die and leave me," she hissed. "I could almost hate you for that." She sighed gustily. His honor was an integral part of him, and she wouldn't have him any other way. "Believe me, lass, 'twas the most difficult thing I ever forced myself to do. Bidding you farewell nigh ripped my heart to pieces, but the alternative was releasing something that might ultimately destroy not only the world, but you as well. Think you I didn't suffer 1,000 deaths fearing that what the Dragar might do to you if I failed to die before they took me over? Verily, I never want to endure such fears again." He ran his hands up her arms, swept them into her hair, and kissed her hard, demanding, his tongue gliding deep. When they were both breathless, she said, "So what happened then?" She traced her fingers over his face, savoring the feel of his rough, unshaven jaw, the softness of his sinfully sensual lips, and oh, the sight of those clear, golden tiger eyes and no shadows. He told her that he'd used magic to rob her of her vision and hearing so that she wouldn't be forced to watch him change and die. A mere moments after he drove the knife into his heart, a man and a woman, of sorts, had appeared, the Tuatha De Danann themselves. "The Tuatha De came. You actually met them," she nearly shouted. "Aye," Diagus smiled, an expression of insatiable curiosity on her face. He suspected that he'd forced to repeat the portion of his story dozens of times over for the next fortnight, so she could ascertain that she hadn't missed a single detail. They did something to the fallen sect members that made them disappear. I have no idea where they went. My chains fell away. The next thing I knew, they'd taken me somewhere else. I was dimly aware then that I was lying on a beach near an ocean in a place that was unlike any other place I've ever been. The colors around me were so brilliant." "What about them?" Chloe exclaimed impatiently. "What were the Tuatha De like?" "Not human, for a certainty. I suspect they truly do not look like us at all, though they choose to appear in a similar fashion. They are much as the legends describe them, tall, willowy, mesmerizing to behold. Verily, they are difficult to look at directly. Had I not been bleeding so weak like as not, their appearance would have fashed me far more than it did. They were immensely powerful. I could feel it in the air around them. I'd thought the ancient Druids possessed of a great power, but they were mere dust notes compared to the Tuatha. And what happened? They healed me. Then explained that they had done and why. The woman that identified herself as the queen of the Tuatha, she'd said that, though he had broken his oath and used the stones for personal motive, he'd absolved himself by being willing to take his own life to prevent the prophecy from being fulfilled. She'd said that by this action he'd proved himself worthy of the Kelter name, and hence was been given a second chance. Diagus smiled wryly. You should have seen me, Chloe Lass, lying there, believing that I was dying and never going to see you again, then realizing not only was she going to free me, but she planned to heal me and return me to you. He paused, wondered what else might transpire, but he couldn't think of any way to explain it other than to make full sense to him. He suspected it never would. There had been a thick tension between the queen and the other Tuatha, whom she called Adam, and he'd lain there. The queen had instructed Adam to heal her, but Adam had protested that Diagus was too near death. Adam had argued that it would cost him too much to save the mortal's life. The queen replied that such was the price that she was claiming due for the formal plea Adam had lodged, whatever that had meant. The male Tuatha had not been pleased. Verily, for such an otherworldly being, he seemed mortally horrified by her decree. What? What? What are you telling me? He said, impatiently cupping his face with her hands. Oh, 'tis not less. I was just thinking there were undercurrents betwixt the two Tuatha that I didn't fathom. At any rate, Adam healed me, and the queen lifted the souls of the Dragar from my body and destroyed them. Is that when she closed the stones? Aye. She said she reconsidered and then decided the power to move through time was not one man should possess. Yet. So why did it take you so long to get back here? Chloe, love, for me but a few hours have passed since that moment in the catacombs. Only when you told me it had been nearly a month did I understand what the queen meant when she said that time didn't pass the same way in our realms. So that part of the legend is true. The ancient tales claim that a single year in the Tuatha realm is roughly the century of an immortal's world. Aye, theirs is a different dimension. He paused, staring down at her with troubled gaze. He took on the sight of her swollen eyes and reddened nose. Oh, lass, you've been grieving me for a long time. I wouldn't have let such a thing happen. What did you do? I waited with Gwen and Justin, and... Oh, we have to call them. She tried to squirm from his lap for the phone, but he tightened his arms around her, refusing to let her go. Anon, love. I'm so sorry you suffered. If I'd known... If you'd known what? Is this what had to happen so I could have you back? I don't have a single regret. It's okay. You're here now, and that's all that matters. I couldn't ask for anything more. Oh, I could, Diagus said quietly. Chloe blinked and looked confused and a bit wounded. Diagus kissed her tenderly. I've been wanting to ask you this for so long, but I feared I may not have a future to promise you. I do now. Will you marry me, Chloe lass? Here, at this moment, in the Druid way. I'm such a fucking loser. And so commenced one of the most thrilling hours of Sylvan McKelter's life. He sat across from the Queen of Tuatha and renegotiated terms. It was fascinating. It was frustrating because she would tell him nothing of herself. It was exhilarating. She was clever and immensely powerful. tenfold what he sensed in the jar. There was no need to ask that the power of the stones be removed from their duties, for he'd felt them close shortly after Daigus had left. The ancient circle of stones had felt abruptly dead, void of energy, left with a mere brush of presence that made them seem slightly more there than the surrounding landscape. When he inquired about it, she merely said that she had reconsidered the Celter's duties. They squabbled for a bit. He squabbled with the Queen over a few minor points, mostly because it was rather like a game of chess, and finessing for the advantage was much more part of her nature as it was his. Gold was required, the amount unimportant, the Queen told him, as it was simple token to be melted and added to the original compact. Naught else was that hand, so he pledged the ring Nellie had given him on their wedding day. Though she'd steadfastly refused to answer any of his questions about their race, she advised him that henceforth she would personally attend one Celter in every generation, so that they would never lose sight of their place in things again. And so the compact was pledged anew, and the responsibility to the Spones would bid a grateful farewell, to be suffered again only on the day, and Sylvan hoped it would not come for a very long time, that man discovered such dangerous secrets on his own. When all was done and the Queen had vanished, Sylvan went in search of Nellie. He had so much to tell her, yet first there was an entirely different matter weighing heavily on his mind. That moment he thought he was dying, he realized what a fool he'd been. He had to try. He had to at least offer, and let Nellie choose whether or not she wanted him forever. He found her in their bedchamber, fluffing the pillows, preparing for bed. In his eyes there was no woman more beautiful. In his heart there was no one more perfect. "Nellie," he said softly. She glanced up and smiled. It was a smile that she loved him, a smile that beckoned him to join her in their bed. Hurrying to her side, he plucked the pillows from her hand and tossed aside. He wanted her full attention, and now that he had it, he found himself unaccountably nervous. He cleared his throat. He prepared. He rehearsed a dozen times what he was going to say. But now that the moment had come, now that he was gazing into her lovely eyes, it all seemed to have fled his mind. He ended up beginning rather badly. "I'm going to die before you do," he said flatly. Nell gave a little sort of ladder, patted him, reasoning. "Oh, Sylvan, where do you cup up with your—" "Hush," he said with a gentle finger against her lips, and kept it there. Her eyes widened, and she gazed at him inquiringly. "The odds that I will die before you, Nellie, are significant. I would not have you grieve me. I never offered my first wife the binding vows because she was not my mate, and I knew it. I never offered them to you because you are my mate, and I knew it." He paused, searching for the right words. His eyes were huge and round, and she had gone very still for hers. "That is without a doubt the most discombobulated bit of... No. That is without a doubt the most discombobulated bit of logic you ever spouted, Sylvan," she finally whispered against his finger. "I couldn't bear the thought of leaving you alone, bound to me." She took his finger from her lips and slipped her hand into his. "I could bear any number of years, Sylvan. I know we'll meet again." "Do you mean that? Truly?" "How could you doubt it? Have I not shown you my love?" "Oh, in so many ways," he thought, exhilarated, and it was nigh time he showed her his. Gently, Sylvan placed his hand between her breasts above her heart, and rested his other hand above his own. "Place your hand up, Topwine." She glanced down at his hand, and her eyes narrowed. "What happened to your ring?" "'Tis no band of simple metal that holds us together, Nellie. 'Tis something far greater than that. As to what happened to my ring, I gave it to the Queen of the Tuatha De Danann when she came and told me Daigus is alive and well. Free at last. What? Nellie gasped. I'll tell you anon, Sylvan said impatiently. Now that he'd made up his mind to take the binding vows, he was desperate for her to answer. He didn't want to waste another moment. He was frantic to claim her, lest something awful happen, lest his heart give out before he could complete the vows. Will you be saying the words after me, lass? Oh, life here is ne'er simple, is it? She exclaimed. Aye, Sylvan, I'll be saying the words. If aught must be lost. So how does one marry a druid? Chloe asked breathlessly. She couldn't stop touching him, couldn't believe that he was alive. And she had him back. Everything had worked out. With a finger beneath her chin, he tipped her face up with a soft kiss. It's fairly simple, really. You nearly did it once, he said, flashing her a smile that fully reached his golden eyes, filling them with warmth. A smile that had promised heated lovemaking the moment they completed this druid rites. And she was definitely in need of some heated lovemaking. She felt as if she might burst from happiness. She frowned, perplexed. I did. Oi. Place your hands atop mine, lass. And he kissed her again. This time, slow and sweet, holding her lower lip hostage for a long, delicious moment. Then he said, Repeat after me, love. She nodded, her eyes sparkling. If aught must be lost, 'twill my honor for yours. I am given, Nellie said, blinking back tears, emotions swelling inside of her, crashing through her like a wave. She may have fallen to her knees had Sylvan not caught her in his arms. Aye, lass, now you're truly mine, forever. You married me that day in the heather, Chloe shouted. And you didn't tell me. Oh, we are going to have a serious talk about how we communicate. And while we're on that subject, we still haven't discussed you leaving that night without telling me. After the lovingness, Tygus purred. Typical man getting out of shit. There'll be plenty of time to speak of such things then. And the lovin' he vowed as he slipped her sweater over her head was going to take a very, very long time. He was no longer dark. Time was no longer his enemy. He'd claimed his mate, and the future loomed ahead of them, resplendent with promise. Wah, wah, wah. Da, 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 the end! Yay! There's some like little side notes about the Dark Fever series, but I'm not going to read those because legit took 2 hours. Yes, second book. Y'all, I've read more in the past 2 months than I have for fucking ever. I'm going to sign it. I'm going to date it. Hold on. How did I date the last time? Hold on. I want to do the same again. Oh, it's cold. Finished on... Well, now it's 12:02 in the morning. What the hell date is it? What's today's date? Like officially, because it's 12:02. It's Friday. Crap. Oh, I'm so sleepy. Oh, no. No, thank you. Oh, my God. The collected works of the physicist Richard Feynman, quantum theory and Feynman diagrams explain. Oh, my fucking God. I would never finish that. I would probably get aggravated before I finished it. What fucking date is it? All right, so it's the 10th. So 12/10. 2021. All right. I'm going to add these to my collection if y'all don't want them. I'm going to add them to my collection. I get stupid about some stuff, you know? Like, I'm so sentimental about things, you know? Such a mush. Those are keepsakes for the grandkids now. My daughter says to me that she was going to give me all 30 books that were on her shelf from that Nana gave her. She doesn't want to read. I was like, shit, okay. That's going to be how it's going to be. Hold on, let me get a glass because I need to celebrate. My cheese and liquor. Yay. Hold on. I'll be right back. Hold on. Oh, ow, my legs. My butt's going numb from sitting in a spot. Oh, Lordy. Oh, my legs. My ass. No, I guess I haven't. I don't know where the heck I put the thing. Oh, scoot. Oh. Oh, it's so bright. Hey, Pierre. I don't know what I'm doing here. Hold on. There we go. All right. You see it? It says blessed. It's been in the cooler. Oh, I need to get some creamer and make like a white Russian or something. Oh, it's thick. Hold on, I'm gonna get some creamer. Pour some in there. Just a little bit more. Just saying. I'm gonna sleep good tonight. You know, I used to think that this stuff was like special occasion thing, but you can buy it whenever the fuck you want to. Got to go, but hope you have a wonderful night. You leaving me? No, don't leave me. Let me sit first. Cheers. Cheers to you, Daniel, son. To the second book and to many more. And to doing things that you never thought that you could do and achieving goals that you never thought that you would ever achieve. And feeling things that you never thought were possible. I hope you have a good night, Daniel. I'm glad that you came for this. Cynical coconut. It's all your fault. It's official. So yes, I have officially finished my second book since 6th grade. So I am happy now. And that book was a pain in the ass to read, too. Pain in the ass. Nothing like eggnog and Kahlua, right? Warm eggnog at that, because I've been drinking it all day. Yummy. It's actually not bad. Eggnog and Kahlua. Maybe I made a new thing. Who knows? Cheers to the holidays, right? May you be blessed. Blessed and never stressed. Blessed. So on that note, I hope y'all have a wonderful evening and that you get some rest and that tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. And now I have to find another book. Because I don't know. I don't think I have the next one in the series. So I'll have to find a different one. If y'all have any suggestions for a romance novel, let me know. For those of you who are into that kind of thing, I'd be more than happy to try to read it for you. If not, I don't know what else we'll be doing. I've gotten so used to my 10 p.m. readings that I don't know what to do now, like if I don't have a book. So I can't sing because it's late at night. But we'll figure out something, right? We'll figure out something. So I hope y'all have a wonderful evening. I'm going to go to bed and think about life for a while. Hope y'all have a good evening. And if I don't see you at 10 a.m. or I don't know, I'm not sure if we're going to be going to the live event tomorrow night. I'm not sure, but we'll see. We'll see. So if I don't see you then I hope I see you at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. And until then, I hope you behave. Have a good night.